Let's go ahead and just get going. And we're going to talk about we are going to talk about Teddy Roosevelt. So Teddy Roosevelt, from Rough Rider to Great American Hero. So the book that there were three books that I really used, and lots of articles, tons of articles. This book right here, which is Theodore Roosevelt by Henry Pringle. He was the winner of the Pulitzer Prize, and this was published just 12 years after Roosevelt's death. The other two books that that were a part of this presentation, there were so many other things that I referred to, were Brett Baer's book on Teddy Roosevelt. That's kind of a modern edition, and also a book called Death on the River of Doubt, which is the story when Roosevelt goes to Brazil and almost dies on the Amazon. We'll talk about that in a little while. So those are the last two, Brett Baer and the Death on the River of Doubt, are the books we're going to give away tonight to two of you at the end of the class. So stay with us. I want to make sure you get the chance. When I looked, I don't know, one of my friends went to Mount Rushmore, and we just started talking about it. And I took a look at Mount Rushmore, and I saw George Washington, the first president. I saw Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence. I saw Teddy Roosevelt, and I saw Lincoln, who was our leader during the Civil War and probably wrote the greatest speech ever delivered. I think 260 words or how many is it? And then I saw Teddy Roosevelt. Didn't know a lot about Teddy Roosevelt, and I had to ask myself, why is he on Mount Rushmore with those other three? So my thesis, I'm going to ask you tonight, I'm going to ask you at the end of the session, so don't leave early. We're going to do a little computer survey. Also, I'm so happy, again, we have Jerry Thomas as our producer tonight. So appreciative to Jerry. Thank you, Jerry. Appreciate your help. Jerry's going to put up a survey. I'm going to let you answer this question, yes or no. Was Teddy Roosevelt one of the greatest American presidents, and should he be on Mount Rushmore? So be ready to do that. So the goals for the class: I want you to understand the energy, charisma, and spirit of Teddy Roosevelt. I want you to learn about his pros and cons. I want you to be able to discuss him. I want you to be able to talk a good game. And when I say talk a good game, if the subject of presidents ever come up, I hope you'll remember a few of the things I'm going to teach you tonight about him. And I hope you'll understand what traits are most important for a successful president to have. Let's talk about the early days, Teddy's early days. Born in 1858 to Theodore Sr. and Martha. His father was Dutch, his mother was Welsh. Teddy was born not well. He had asthma. He had trouble breathing. It was so bad the family had to move to southeast New York to the Catskills, hoping that higher altitude would help him. From the beginning, he had a puny body. He was small. He was ashamed. He was weak. He worked hard most of his adult life to get stronger. And his father was a moral compass to him, and Roosevelt often referred to his father as the ideal man. His father inherited money and carried on a profitable glass importing business, and later he went into banking. His father was an important person. He was one of the founders of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which you all know what that is. And he also was in on the founding of the Orthopedic Hospital of New York City. It was important. And remember, this is right around the time before the Civil War. His mother, Martha, had relatives fighting for people in the South, and Teddy Roosevelt's father was favoring the Union troops. So that must have been kind of a harsh dinner table, I would bet. But Teddy had one brother, two sisters. And as kids, they just lived a great life traveling to Europe. But Civil War broke out in 1861. The death of Lincoln on April 15th, 1865 greatly impacts everything that Roosevelt will do from the rest of his life. You'll see him in this red circle, in this window. He stood and he watched as Lincoln's funeral procession went down the street, and he talked about Lincoln. When he talked about his governing style, he talked about Lincoln being a partner in that and how important Lincoln was. In May 1870, Teddy's worried about his health. The second thing is education. A gym is erected on the floor, a boxing ring, where he, for the rest of his life, loved boxing. His father told him, when you think about this, he said, Teddy, you have the mind, but not the body. He said, you have to keep working in it, Teddy. And Teddy worked hours on the horizontal bars, the punching bag, taking boxing lessons. And you start to see him make big progress in 1875 at the age of 17 with dashes in track, the broad jump, the pole vault, track. Family moves to Oyster Bay, which was right on Nassau, New York, where Teddy's father lived. Teddy, that's where he learned to ride and shoot. Oyster Bay is on Long Island. A serious handicap Teddy had was his defective eyesight. You can see that picture of him right there. His eyesight always looked a little bit off. He was struck in his eye while boxing with a young Army officer. He had a hemorrhage in his retina, and he never was perfect. Nobody in the country really knew the extent of how bad his eyesight was, but you could tell just by looking at him that he was just a little bit off. The family traveled throughout Roosevelt's younger years, and he especially loved Germany, and he admired the Germans for their hard work. Later in his political life, German Kaiser was very important to him. Kaiser was the person who ran Germany, and he would get together with him many times to talk about politics and leadership. But Teddy particularly enjoyed Europe, particularly enjoyed history and modern languages, and he prepared to enter Harvard like most of his friends. So Harvard in 1876, I thought this was hilarious. Teddy enters Harvard as a freshman in 1876. And after it's all over, he says, I obtained very little from Harvard. He said it was a dreary place. And he said, all his peers went there because their friends were there. He didn't smoke or drink. He did chew tobacco. His appearance started to change, but he was a fish out of water at Harvard. He always asked questions, protested with the professors. While at Harvard, he wrote a letter to his mother, and he talked about the fact he had never spent an unhappy day unless it was his own fault. And in 1878, he meets a girl named Alice Hathaway Lee. And his first interest in politics came while he was at Harvard. He was a Rutherford B. Hayes fan. Student sentiment was behind Hayes. Hayes was a proponent of civil service reform, something you'll hear constantly about in tonight's class. How important it was back then, because everything was patronage, everything was corrupt, everything was a grift. And one thing you'll learn tonight, I know I've got a lot of friends from Ohio out there tonight, is just how many of the people we're going to talk about during this time came from Ohio. There were so many people. You'll hear them all. This is the first, Rutherford B. Hayes from Delaware, Ohio. Hayes would fight powerful bosses in New York, and he gave Roosevelt's father an appointment as the port collector of the city of New York City. As a boxer, Roosevelt's goal was all about winning. He loved to win. He was 135 pounds, won his first match, but the second match, he was just drilled. The New York Times reported that Roosevelt suffered, quote unquote, heavy punishment. So boxing, it was important to Roosevelt throughout his entire career. He had a boxing ring in the White House from 1901 to 1909. He would spar in there, have boxing matches come in here. He loved the sport. It was something that really made him happy. So he meets Alice Hathaway and tells one of his friends, see that girl, I'm going to marry her. And Alice was repelled by Teddy at first, but his cousin kept bringing him over to see Alice, and the courtship goes from 1878 to 1879, and Teddy and Alice are married on his 22nd birthday in 1880. Alice is 19 years old. After marriage, Teddy decides to take up the law. He joins the District Republican Club. He and Alice visit Europe, and his interest in war kept growing. He was always fascinated with it. He returned home in 1881 and found himself a candidate for the state legislature. He won, and all of a sudden, at the age of 23, he is Assemblyman Theodore Roosevelt. Alice had just little interest in politics. She didn't want anything to do with it, but what she did want Teddy to know was that she was going to have a baby in 1883. So this is an unbelievable tragedy. A tragedy strikes Roosevelt. He's at work in New York as an assemblyman, misses the birth of his baby, comes home 2 days later on February 13th, 1884, and he comes to see his baby. At 3 a.m. in the morning, his mother dies of typhoid fever. The same day, his wife, Alice, dies of Bright's disease, a kidney disease. I can't imagine what that could be like. Roosevelt told his brother, there's a curse in the house. On February 16th, just 3 days later, Roosevelt buries his mom and his wife. On February 20th, he's back in Albany working on a reform bill. And many people said that Roosevelt never spoke about Alice again. It's just tragic, hard to believe story. Money, his father was able to leave him some money when he died. But Roosevelt, probably one of his biggest weaknesses, he was terrible with money. He was always, the way they said it back then was he was embarrassed for funds. He was poor. He was always looking to supplement his income. He was reckless with money matters. But one thing he did do was he cobbled together $20,000 and became a partner at Putnam Sons, a book publisher. He was an incredible writer, wrote 135,000 letters, 35 books. And the publishing relationship with Putnam Sons turned into his way he sustained himself after, during and after politics. And in 1883, he paid $14,000 for a cattle ranch that he had visited, and we'll talk a lot about his adventures out west in a few minutes, but he also married his second wife, Edith Caro. This was the family, 5 children with Edith, and one child, Alice, from the first marriage. The kids lived a great life, and just like Teddy, when he was growing up, they often went to Europe and traveled. So Roosevelt hated the law, but one thing he was always worried about was civil reform and corruption, patronage jobs. So at the young age, he was endorsed by several civic associations. And even though he had no experience really in politics, he's 22, he's immediately popular. One policy that Teddy took on from the beginning, which will be different from some presidents, we might make a few comparisons to another president, maybe a little later in the presentation. Stay tuned. But one thing about Teddy, he was a free trader, no tariffs. Even though tariffs comprised a lot of the revenue of the United States government back in the 1900s, Teddy hated tariffs, didn't want to have anything to do with them. Teddy's first speech got the attention of the New York Sun that said Roosevelt was a striking exception to the usual young reformer. And he rose to the pages of the newspaper all the time because of him fighting corruption. The corruption angle, I know we hear about so many politicians fighting against corruption, but we never seem to get anything done, do we? Teddy was a doer. You'll hear about him fighting corruption, and what he actually did was incredible for that time. So the New York Sun says he's a striking exception to the usual young reformer. The New York Post says Roosevelt accomplished more good than any man his age. Boy, wouldn't you like to have somebody write that about you? Early success. Grover Cleveland was elected the Democrat governor of New York. Cleveland was a Democrat. Roosevelt was in the assembly. He thought Cleveland was corrupt. Roosevelt's elected minority leader of the party. This is virtually without any precedent that someone his age would be elected minority leader of the party. He all the time investigated city government corruption. He focused on the police, cracked down on sweatshops. He went wherever he could. He considered leaving the party when the party nominated James Blaine in 1884, but he continuously focused on fighting corruption, and that's a trait that I'm going to write up on my trait board. I hope this works okay. My problem is my handwriting's terrible. Corruption, all right. So what I've got is a list of traits we're going to write down about Teddy. And then at the end, we're going to see what you guys think. If you think if the trait is good, or if you think maybe it shouldn't be on the list. So Fighting corruption's the first trait I'm going to write down. Henry Cabot Lodge became his best friend. Lodge, I'm sure you've heard his name, was from Massachusetts. He was a U.S. Senator from 1893 to 1924. Throughout Cabot Lodge's life, he always tried to persuade people to support Roosevelt. And he was one of the first people that originally pushed for Roosevelt to become president. And you'll hear some interesting takes on how that happened. So Roosevelt, as a Republican, had to support this guy, Blaine. Roosevelt wasn't a guy who played well. He didn't play well with the Republican Party and the boss. He said, "It's bad enough to allow a man who is dishonest to stand as a representative of your party. You can, however, invent excuses for it." Think about that. Think about a candidate you've been told you have to support that you don't like that much. And think about the excuses you've had to invent to support them. I can see where he came from. Blaine lost, wasn't a good candidate. Roosevelt said, "I got to get out of New York, and I'm heading west." He went to the West in 1883. He had no idea what it was like to become a cattleman. He met 4 businessmen. He loved the West. He invested in a couple ranches, one in South Dakota and one in Medora, North Dakota. That 5,200 figure should be 52,000. Sorry about that. Yeah, in the evening, he would just sit out and watch the sunset in the West, look at the beauty. His big phrase he used to talk to people was, "Hasten forward quickly there. Hasten forward quickly there." He was known for his colorful clothing. Like you see this bottom left-hand image of him, that's how he dressed. And he was known a lot for his pearl-handled revolver and his beautiful finished Winchester rifle. That's the pearl-handled revolver, pretty nice. It's pretty incredible, isn't it? Roosevelt's words about the West: "When I'm out West, I feel like I'm able to face anything. I can face anything." The South Dakotans loved Teddy. They tried to get him to run for office in South Dakota while he was there. At his other ranch, he played a role nearly every boy plays in his imagination. He wore gaudy clothes. He was appointed deputy sheriff. He'd go out and catch thieves, throw them in jail. He challenged people to duels. Fortunately, he didn't do it. But in 1887, there was a cattle disease. He lost almost all his cattle and ended up losing almost all of his money that he had invested in the ranches. He had to wind up his affairs out there, which were substantial. And he said, "Well, I guess I've got to go back east and get back into politics." He runs for mayor of New York in 1886. He runs on honesty and civic affairs, where he's fighting corruption, and he supports the working man and increased wages. And his motto is, "If we stand together, we can win." During this time, it was a terrible blow for him to really lose 3 times. He had to suffer through supporting Blaine. He campaigned for Blaine and he lost. And now he had lost the mayor's race in 1886. Around this time, he and his wife Edith purchased their new home, Sagamore Hill, which is close to Oyster Bay on Long Island. Another time I was teaching this class, somebody told me about visiting Sagamore Hill, visiting Roosevelt's home. If you ever get to, I hear it's amazing. When he was on a trip to Africa, he caught over 296 species, and I understand they're all through that house. And it's really incredible if you ever get out to Long Island, New York. Benjamin Henry Harrison is elected in 1889. Everything at that time was patronage. Roosevelt supported him. Harrison says, he's talking to his aides, he says, "Roosevelt constitutes a minor obligation for us." So they give Roosevelt a $3,500 a year civil service position to help him reform the post office. This is 1889. I want you to think about what Roosevelt did. It's incredible. He replaces 985 postmasters. Eventually, he replaces 30,000 that were corrupt postmasters in office. I just want you to think through what it must have been like to get rid of 30,000 people in 1889 without computers or anything to communicate, and how hard it was. But he served on the Civil Service Commission for 6 years. And one of his main goals during that time was improving the examination where men and women are chosen for government work, the civil service exam. Next, he's appointed to run the police board for the city of New York. And he's dealt with a lot of police matters as a state assemblyman, so he understands police. And he's convinced that the police reform is all part of this corruption that he's worried about. While doing this, he gets to meet William Howard Taft, who will become a big part of this story in a while. He's constantly spending time with Henry Cabot Lodge. Him and Edith dine out 3 to 4 times a week. People are coming to Sagamore Hill. Everybody knows him. Everybody wants to be on his list. And all of a sudden, he's elected president of the police board. The police say, oh, no. They say, oh, no. We don't want to have anything to do with this guy. His teeth became famous at this time. He was the butt of so many cartoonists in every newspaper around the country. Remember, there were so many newspapers back then. I think in the early 1800s, there were like 397 daily papers or something like that. But Teddy's teeth were always famous when they wanted to poke at him about something. But he would prowl the streets of New York City. He would find patrolmen not doing their job who might be in a bar drinking. He would take them in, and the citizens just loved it. The public just applauded everything he did. They would have articles about him every day. He wasn't really a prohibitionist. He didn't drink, but one of the things he did, which really angered so many people, was he stopped the Germans from being able to drink on Sunday in New York City, which just outraged so many people. He fought crime during the police years, and it really made him a national figure. Roosevelt was police commissioner of New York, but everybody in the whole country started to hear about him, and he really started to bring the concept of honesty to the police. It was around this time when Roosevelt was taking on the police that his friend Henry Cabot Lodge wrote to him in a letter, and he said, I do not say that you are to be president tomorrow, but I'm sure it may be and that it can be. Lodge's goal is to make Roosevelt more known to the world, to make him the next president of the United States. William McKinley, who's from Ohio, another Ohioan, runs for president in 1897. Roosevelt believes McKinley's an honorable man. McKinley would run against William Jennings Bryan, an incredible orator. He was incredibly popular, Jennings Bryan was. The story was that out of the 76 million people that lived in the United States, 5 million people went to see William Jennings Bryan speak. He drew huge crowds. And McKinley asked Roosevelt, can you help me go against this guy because he's just getting so much attention? Bryan had a few problems. He was on one of the sides in the Scopes monkey trial against evolution. So in the Scopes monkey trial, really half the United States was for, half against. And so automatically Bryan had a bunch of people that didn't like him. That helped McKinley. And so Roosevelt went to speak about McKinley and talk about how great he was. McKinley ends up getting 271 electoral votes to 176 for Bryan. And he's our 25th president of the United States. McKinley nominates Roosevelt to be Secretary of the Navy. Roosevelt loves the armed forces, and he actually becomes known as the modern father of the U.S. Navy. Cabot Lodge pushes for the appointment. McKinley appoints him. The Secretary of the Navy, 60 years old, doing almost nothing. Roosevelt gets to work, gets to his hands-on thing where he's doing everything, and many people immediately said, now, this young guy, Roosevelt, is he the assistant? But Roosevelt pushed for a large Navy, building more ships. And like I said, a lot of people considered Roosevelt the father of the modern U.S. Navy. At this time, the Spanish-American War was starting. The United States, Cuba was a big trading partner. There was a battleship Maine that was traveling with goods down to Cuba. and it was blown up in the Havana harbor, and it killed 260 people. No one ever really explained how it happened, but this was a big, big, big deal. And at that time, Spain, it was almost bankrupt. They had 18 million people. And Roosevelt told McKinley that war alone was compatible with our national honor. We will have this war for the freedom of Cuba. So Roosevelt was clear. I have been a leading advocate of war. It's my duty to take part in it. And around that time, Roosevelt really spoke out about foreign affairs, became really well known for a second trait, foreign affairs. It would continue throughout all his presidencies. McKinley authorizes 3 cavalry units to go down to Cuba to take care of this problem. And the one that Roosevelt was asked to run was called the Roosevelt Rough Rider Camp. And there had never been such a novel organization that had been gathered together. I mean, this is a group of cowboys. This is a bunch of Harvard people, a bunch of Yale people, a bunch of Princeton people. This was steeplechase riders. This was just a band thrown together under one great leader. Roosevelt arrives in Florida, May 15th, 1898. The Rough Riders, they're in a bar drinking beer. Roosevelt says, "Men, go in and drink all the beer you want, and I will pay for it." My kind of guy, definitely there. This is what they look like. There he is, right in the middle of them. Teddy and the Rough Riders, 1898, known as the first United States Volunteer Cavalry. Rough Riders left for Tampa in 1898. They take a boat down to Cuba. And right in the beginning, the Rough Riders are ambushed. They lose 16 men, 50 wounded. That's 66 men. A huge number. Roosevelt says, we wanted the first whack at the Spaniards, and we got whacked. The struggle of war happened. Roosevelt was angry at McKinley. McKinley couldn't get him what he needed to win the war down in Cuba. And it was all due to logistics, which you could imagine back then how hard it would be to get things down there. But he loved taking care of the troops. He loved the troops. And on June 30th, they received orders to advance to Santiago. Roosevelt was brave. He was reckless. He mounted a horse. He shouted encouragement to the guys. He wore a blue polka dot handkerchief. And he said, "I waved my hat and we went up the hill." Later, he confessed to his friend Henry Cabot Lodge, "We lost 25% of our men. We needed thousands of reinforcements, men, batteries, food, munitions. How did I ever escape?" I mean, this guy was incredibly brave. That's the trait. This guy was brave beyond imagination. Sorry about the bad writing. He was really, really something. This is the image, which my guess is you've probably seen, a very famous painting done by Frederick Remington in 1898 called The Charge of the Rough Riders at San Juan Hill. This image was published everywhere. It made Roosevelt a national hero. So I will tell you that a few historians over the years have argued in the painting, was Roosevelt really on the horse? I don't know. It sure is a great painting, and it inspired the country and brought the country together. It was really something. So Roosevelt got his reinforcements. The logistics finally came together, and the war ended. The Rough Riders returned to New York. Roosevelt said of the Rough Riders, "We are a knit closer together than any body of men I know. I would honestly rather have my position of colonel than any other position in the world." All throughout his life, even when he was president, you'll find that people referred to him not as President Roosevelt or Vice President Roosevelt. They referred to him as Colonel Roosevelt, which is what he liked to be known as. Roosevelt comes back to New York in 1898 with Tim Woodruff, runs for governor of New York. Based on his work with the Rough Riders, he was known throughout the entire country. He becomes governor of New York at 41. Huge crowds show up to see this Teddy Roosevelt, this Rough Rider that we've seen and we've read so much about in the newspaper. While campaigning for governor, this is what he says. He says, "Our flag is a proud flag, and it stands for liberty and civilization." He wins the governor's contest over Augustus Van Wyck, but only by 1.4%. It was close, and his term would only be for 2 years. But now he's governor. His goals as governor of New York: tax reform, a tax on corporations. He thought corporations had way too much power. An improved civil service law, reform of the municipal machine, and integrity in New York City. So Roosevelt was interested in a second term as governor, but he knew McKinley would be nominated for the presidency in 1900. Roosevelt attends a reunion of Rough Riders in New York. They're all gathering around him, just like the old days, and they're all coming up to him and saying, "Teddy, you need to challenge McKinley and run for president." And Teddy says, "I'm not a candidate." Henry Cabot Lodge says to Roosevelt, "You need to become war secretary. If you're war secretary, you'll be the next president." Roosevelt plays down this choice. He starts to be talked about as a possible VP candidate for McKinley. And Roosevelt's just a guy, a strong-willed guy who has lots of feelings about everything. And he rubbed all the higher-up Republican, those Republican guys. What's the word I want to use? I better not use that word. He pushed all the top guys a little bit more than they wanted to be pushed. So the top Republican leaders came up with this plan. They said, well, let's get rid of Teddy. Let's put him in a position where we don't have to deal with him, where we don't have to worry about him. Let's make him vice president. To be honest with you, he was kind of like the Kamala Harris of his time. They just wanted to get rid of him, give him nothing to do. They said, let's make him McKinley's VP. They do. Teddy angers all the top honchos. They can't stand him. He wasn't liked in the beginning, but that sure changed over the years. This is another campaign against William Jennings Bryan, a second campaign. Bryant becomes one of the only two people in the United States history to ever lose 3 times in a presidential race. Roosevelt goes to St. Paul, Minnesota, and prophesizes about what would happen if McKinley's defeated. He said the Democrats will reassert the doctrines of anarchy if they win. In November 1900, McKinley wins 292 votes to 155 for William Jennings Bryan. Roosevelt at 42 is the vice president of the United States. Extra credit question. Somebody else tell me later on when we take questions, who was the only other person that ran 3 times for president and was defeated all 3 times? Oh, and then it happened. September 6, 1901, McKinley's shot, assassinated. Roosevelt, they call Roosevelt, he's in Buffalo. He goes out hiking even though he knows McKinley's been shot. They have to track him down on Saturday morning, 7 days later, and say, "You're president of the United States." McKinley's death it deeply impacted Roosevelt because Roosevelt really liked McKinley and he thought he was just a real anti-corruption guy, a little bit like him. But he takes the oath in front of all of McKinley's cabinet except for Hay and Treasury Secretary Gage. This is what it looked like. This is what it looked like, McKinley being assassinated. Roosevelt speaks about the terrible assassination. "I will show the people at once that the administration of government will not falter in spite of this terrible blow." At this time, we have another Ohioan enter this story, Mark Hanna, who's an American businessman and senator from Ohio. He and Roosevelt had routinely fought over politics. Hanna writes Roosevelt on the day of the inauguration. He writes Roosevelt a letter. He says, "You are young. You are only 43 years old. Go slow. Don't make so many changes that the country won't be able to accept." Roosevelt listens to what Hannah says, keeps all of McKinley's cabinet in place, that makes very few changes. The country, despite this tragedy, was thrilled at the novelty of this Rough Rider, this colorful president leading them. Remember, Roosevelt is 43 years old, the youngest president in United States history. Roosevelt at work, he's a worker. He's there at 8:30 in the morning. He has visitors for breakfast, lunch, dinner. And he says to one of his aides, he says, "Oh, you know how much I like to hunt, but I better curb my desire for hunting." He said, "I do not want people to get the idea that they have a sporting president." Roosevelt, wanted to help the whole South. He wanted to help African Americans. He meets almost immediately with Booker T. Washington. I don't know how many students out there attended our class on Booker T. Washington. The number of connections Booker T. Washington had was incredible. Roosevelt invites Booker T. Washington to the White House. He's talked about. This is the first time people talk about him having an African American come there. But Roosevelt listens to Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington says, "I need you to appoint a judge." His name is Thomas Good Jones. And Roosevelt appoints him almost immediately, sends a signal. Number 4 on our list of traits is just how hard of a worker Roosevelt is. They're at all hours of the day and night working, getting involved directly on things. One of his big things was busting trusts. There were big companies. Roosevelt felt like these big companies were too strong, and they were unfair to their employees. And one of the things you'll appreciate about him is he had a real compassion for the everyday person, the worker. We'll talk about workmen's compensation in a little bit and why that was so important. But these were corporations, big places: U.S. Steel, the railroads, the American Sugar Company. And in Roosevelt's eyes, in no other country was such power held by such few men. It would be a constant theme for him. We'll have more examples. An early action, he takes on the Northern Securities Company. Roosevelt didn't like to work with Congress. He couldn't stand to work with them, actually, and he didn't like to work with courts. Imagine that. His goal was to strengthen the executive level. He filed suit against the Northern Securities Company in March 1902, and he thought that the court should reflect his convictions, but he just never was sure that it would. In 1902, something cool happens. Roosevelt's participating in a bear hunting trip in Mississippi. While hunting, he declares the behavior of some of the hunters as unsportsmanlike after he refused to kill a bear they had captured. The word travels around the country. Roosevelt won't kill bear, and a shop owner in New York named Morris Meacham comes up with the idea. She creates a plush stuffed bear, places them in the front window. She gets a hold of Roosevelt and says, "Can I call this the teddy bear?" Roosevelt, of course, says, "Absolutely," and it's an instant success. All around the country, ladies, children, carrying bears with them in public at Roosevelt events. Teddy even started to use the teddy bear as his mascot when he ran for election. So that's where the teddy bear came from. I bet that's an extra you probably didn't know you'd get tonight. That's a great story. I think this is a lesson we need to learn about the Supreme Court, that, you think you know what you're going to get, but you never do. And Roosevelt decides to appoint Oliver Wendell Holmes to the Supreme Court, hoping that Holmes will take his side in the Northern Securities case, and that he can stomp down this big company. Holmes was, I'm sure you've heard his name, was just a gallant soldier in the Civil War. The Northern Security case comes up, and by a 5-4 decision, Roosevelt loses the Northern Securities case. The deciding vote against the Northern Securities case was Oliver Wendell Holmes, who he had just appointed. Roosevelt was incensed. He couldn't believe what had happened. And he talked to his friend Henry Cabot-Lodge about it. And this is a funny story. Henry Cabot-Lodge talks to Roosevelt and says, "Teddy, now you know that the emperor in the country of Korea, when he got mad at the Supreme Court, he abolished the Supreme Court. Have you ever heard anything so funny as that, or packing the court, or whatever you want to do? But see, that idea happened 120 some odd years ago, and but at least Roosevelt didn't call the Supreme Court fools, lapdogs, and rhinos, right? He didn't call them that, but he couldn't stand the courts. He couldn't stand Congress. He thought he could do it all, and really, for a large part, he could. But trouble stems in the coal fields in 1902. 140,000 miners strike. They hadn't had any increased wages in 22 years. There was no workman's compensation. There were 358 injuries in the coal fields. Coal ran the country. No coal, no heat. And the price of coal just started rising rapidly in New York City. Several other places, the schools were closed because there was no coal to heat the schools. Roosevelt directly intervened in the coal strike, and you'll see this happens time and time again with him. He intervenes and gets personally involved. The strikers say to Roosevelt, Roosevelt says, I want to put together a commission of people to solve this problem. The strikers say, okay, do it. And what does Roosevelt do? He reaches across party lines, gets several people involved, including Grover Cleveland, who, if you remember, he had said that he thought was so corrupt. But Cleveland and the commission meet, and the five-person commission also included famous banker J.P. Morgan. And the five-person commission was able to solve the coal crisis with Roosevelt helping. Roosevelt helped negotiate the coal strike to the end. The workers were given a 10% increase, and given other kind of promises. You know, Roosevelt had done it. He had negotiated the coal strike to an end. This is another trait, number 5. He was willing to get personally involved. A great trait that he had. This is what it looked like in 1902. This is what it looked like when all these people didn't have heat. The psychological effect of Roosevelt's triumph to the nation was huge. Plus, now they had coal, and on top of that, labor was on the side of Roosevelt, which you normally don't kind of expect. This was about the time when you started hearing the term "speak softly and carry a big stick." That was Roosevelt's kind of policy, and his real policy was the Monroe Doctrine, which said countries have to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. And Germany was encroaching in Venezuela and in the Russian-Japanese War, and Roosevelt just wasn't shy about it. He called up Kaiser Wilhelm, who was Emperor of Germany, and he said, listen, you get out of the Western Hemisphere, or I will have Admiral Dewey's ships down south in a few days. Roosevelt threatened the Kaiser, and he won. He had won with his big stick. A border scuffle happened in Canada where you remember that Alaska had come to the U.S. from Russia, but long before that, there had been a treaty between Great Britain and Russia with Canada where the boundary of Alaska had been carved out differently, and this was the time of the gold rush. Canada saw an opportunity to get more gold, have access to that coast, and came and they said to Roosevelt, that's our territory. Roosevelt told his secretary, I'm not going to be part of this blackmail. And a group of impartial jurists were created that voted in favor of Roosevelt. And once again, Teddy had another win with his big stick. On war, Roosevelt said there are many well-meaning philosophers who declaim against the unrighteousness of war. He said, war is a dreadful thing. An unjust war is a crime against humanity. The choice must ever be in favor of righteousness, and every effort must be made to avoid war. The Panama Canal. You've heard about it a lot in the last couple of years, but it came from Roosevelt. It was a big idea he had, that there had to be a way. He saw a boat try to go around the Southern Horn, and he said, we've got to have a way to get through in Panama. The problem he had was that there was Congress They favored the canal being in Nicaragua, and they had political reasons that they wanted it to be there. So Roosevelt does something unique. He gets a French artist together, and they create a postage stamp of Nicaragua. And on the postage stamp in Nicaragua, there's a volcano, and Roosevelt puts the volcano on the postage stamp. And it's probably, when you go in the post office, they may have 20, 25 stamps. They probably had a few back then. There was this Nicaragua postage stamp with a volcano, and all of a sudden the American people saw in front of their very eyes their new canal in Nicaragua being hit by a volcano and being blown up. And all of a sudden, guess what happens? They go to the Panama Canal. This was Roosevelt's message to Congress. And I just don't, for the life of me, understand how we went so far off track. Roosevelt says, we must assure that the isthmus is free and unobstructed for the transfer of goods. And this is the sixth trait that Roosevelt has. He was a marketer. For whatever he wanted to do, he was a great marketer of what he wanted to get accomplished. This is him. He was amazing. Can you imagine seeing the President of the United States in a land mover like this picture of Roosevelt on the right? The guy helped build the Panama Canal. He was a big idea guy. Panama was a big idea. That's trait number 7. This guy had them. He was incredible. They talked about him. The media loved him. They drew cartoons about him. He was everywhere. The Panama Canal opened on August 15th, 1914, and he was truly the hands-on president. His second term begins in 1903, and Roosevelt journeys via train with great enthusiasm across the country. The House passes his measure of corporate reform, and Roosevelt does something for the people. He establishes pensions for people between the age of 62 and 70 years old. Imagine how hard probably that was to do in 1903. In politics, Roosevelt said, we have to do a great many things that we ought not to do. We have to do a great many things that we ought not to do. This was him referring to the give and take and constant bickering of what he had to do to keep people happy. Hanna decided to challenge him in 1904, the senator from Ohio, and he tested the winds, but Hanna became sick with typhoid. He died. Roosevelt said of the Ohio and Hanna, he said, Hanna's death is very sad. No man has larger traits. He was able to speak fondly, nicely about people that weren't on his side, that helped embrace the land, really. Alton B. Parker is chosen to run against Roosevelt in the second term. The Democrats thought they could beat Roosevelt because they thought labor would join their side. They thought the big corporations would join their side. But Andrew Carnegie comes out and says, I hope Roosevelt will win. The meat packers come out and say, we support Roosevelt emphatically. Labor comes out and says, we want Teddy. Roosevelt wins 336 votes to 140. This is kind of the go-to years for Teddy. This, everybody contacted him. Emperors and kings sought his advice, and he said these words when he was elected the second time: tomorrow I shall come into my office in my own right, and then watch out for me. This is what the ceremony looked like. It's really something. I asked earlier when I did this class, somebody, when did film first happen? But this had to be close to it, 1904. If anybody knows that, maybe let me know for sure. But, every foreign leader wanted to meet Teddy. Roosevelt's message, thanks to the giver of good. The Rough Riders are in his background cheering him on. Roosevelt paid tributes to that person he saw in 1865 during the processional of Lincoln. He paid tribute to Lincoln. And the band played "There Will Be a Hot Time in the Old Town Tonight." Roosevelt says workmen's compensation must be given to the workers to eliminate child labor abuse. His words, "Together, towards all nations large and small, our attitude must be one of cordial and sincere friendship. But justice and generosity in a nation or as an individual count most when shown not by the weak but by the strong." Japan and Russia have a dust-up in 1904. Roosevelt gets personally involved. He creates a negotiation for peace. William Howard Taft is called in. Taft is from Ohio, another Ohioan, to be the Secretary of State. Together with Taft, they're able to create peace between this terrible breakout between Russia and Japan. Because of it, Roosevelt wins the Nobel Prize for Peace in 1906, trait number 8. Roosevelt loved peace. That's that. An amazing thing Roosevelt did happen with the Japanese. The Americans didn't like the Japanese after all this war talk between Japan and Russia. And anti-American riots broke out in Tokyo and on the West Coast. Japanese people were treated unfairly. In October in San Francisco, the Japanese decided to exclude 75,000 Japanese from the schools. Roosevelt announced that California, in no uncertain terms, could not treat the Japanese unfairly. And he immediately sent a message to Congress demanding that California protect the rights of the Japanese. Roosevelt really cared for the people, all the people. And all these things that were going on around the world with peace, Roosevelt decided to send a battle fleet around the world just to show that the U.S. was ready for anything. Roosevelt made friends with Japan. In 1906, the railroads were a concern because they were taking advantage of Americans. They were cutting their rates to strengthen powerful shippers, to force out weaker competitors. Roosevelt established a commission that would have the authority to fix rates. And Roosevelt had indictments on the railroad officers, put some of them in jail for giving unjust rebates. Standard Oil, John D. Rockefeller. Roosevelt found that Standard Oil was one of the large benefiters of this railroad scheme. He gets a law through Congress, 346-7. The Senate votes 71-3 to fine Standard Oil $29 million. Could you imagine this kind of agreement happening in Congress now? It would never happen. He was a unique guy. He could bring people together from many different sides to do the right thing for Americans. I guess my question is, could that be done now? Could it be done now? Muckraking became important then. The book The Jungle by Upton Sinclair that talked about the filth and the disease in packing houses became an important book. Roosevelt said, "I read the book with interest." He passed a meat inspection bill. He loved the national forests. There's another person who's actually called the father of the American park system. His name kind of escapes me now, but Roosevelt could have been. He established 5 national parks: Crater Lake, Oregon; Wind Cave, South Carolina; Sully's Hill, North Dakota; Mesa Verde, Colorado; and Platte, Oklahoma. And he proclaimed 4 new national monuments. This is a big idea guy. He understood conservation. And when we talk about the square deal later on, one of the 3 parts of the square deal was conservation. Teddy said, this is the property of the people. We have to take care of it. He passed the Newlands Act to assist 3 million acres of American land in parks. In 1907, something really bad happened. A bank started to fail, the Knickerbocker Bank. And on October 22nd, word came out that Knickerbocker couldn't meet its obligations. J.P. Morgan, the great financier, was asked, can you solve this problem? And Morgan had been asked to do just about everything from the late 1890s through the 1900s when it came to finance. And Morgan said, I can't go on being everybody's goat. There was a run on the Trust Company of America. Roosevelt had to inject $25 million into the banking system to really make the country comfortable. This was known as the financial panic of 1907. 6 banks would go bankrupt over 6 weeks, and this shook Roosevelt. He didn't understand finance. He wasn't good with his personal finance. He didn't know what to do. But he got in with his Treasury secretary, and he displayed trait 9. He's a fixer. He fixes things. He fixed the system, and this is what it looked like in 1907. This is what the panic looked like. Can you imagine what a mess like this would look like now? But Roosevelt took care of it. In 1907, Roosevelt discussed immigration, and I just want you to hear his thoughts about it.
In the first place, we should insist that if the immigrant who comes here in good faith becomes an American and assimilates himself to us, he shall be treated on an exact equality with everyone else. For it is an outrage to discriminate against any such man because of creed, their birthplace, their origin. But this is predicated upon the person's becoming in every facet an American, and nothing but an American. There can be no divided allegiance here. Any man who says he is an American but something else also is not an American at all. We have room for but one flag, the American flag. We have room for but one language here, and that is the English language. And we have room for but one sole loyalty, and that is a loyalty to the American people. Theodore Roosevelt, our 26th President of the United States.
You have to remember, this was the time between the years of 1900 and 1914 that 9 million people came in through Ellis Island. This is what Roosevelt said. If the immigrant assimilates himself to the U.S., he will be treated on an exact equality basis. This is predicated on the person becoming in every fact an American and nothing but an American. There can be no divided allegiance here. We have room for but one flag, the American flag. We have room for but one language, the English language. And we have room for but one loyalty, and that is loyalty to the American people. One more trait to put up on the board. Number 10, he was principled. Something happens in Brownsville regarding a Negro regiment in Texas. There's 3 white infantry units visit this regiment, and an incident between the Negro regiment and the white U.S. infantries break out. Upon hearing about the prejudice against the Negro troops, Roosevelt personally intervenes and has all 160 of the white Army personnel discharged. This meant that they would be dishonorably discharged. They would forfeit their pensions, in some cases become destitute. Yeah, Roosevelt was worried about the Negro vote in the 1906 congressional campaign, but he was also worried about doing the right thing, which over and over again he did. On feminism, this is a surprise. In 1880, Roosevelt writes his dissertation on the practicality of equalizing men and women before the law. He wasn't a champion of equal rights, but he supported the movement. Curiously, somewhat like our Vice President, J.D. Vance, Roosevelt attacked the childless marriage and the marriage with only 1 or 2 children. He also hated easy divorce laws. I just think it's interesting. In 1880, Roosevelt was thinking about feminism. How many people would be? If he would have turned that dissertation into his Harvard professors, would they have laughed at him in 1880? I don't know. He was always ahead of the curve. On reading, fascinating. I just want to remember this. He was an omnivorous reader. He would always read books, plays, poems, essays, and in his autobiography, he talks about the importance of reading with this as his approach. I am part of everything that I have read. I am part of everything that I have read. Theodore Roosevelt. On taxes, it may surprise you. You might think he's not a taxer. He is. He says most great civilized countries have an income tax and an inheritance tax. In my judgment, both should be part of our federal taxation system. Ooh, that kind of surprised me. But as you'll see, he kind of moves over to the progressive wing in a very few years, and he felt that that's what should happen. On workmen's compensation, he pushed for it. He said, the business which is hurt by the movement for honesty is the kind of business which in the long run it pays the country to have hurt. Workmen's compensation, really by his pushing, came into effect in 1911 in Wisconsin. Doesn't sound important. I was a small business owner. I hated workman's comp. There were days I didn't know if I'd get an $80,000 bill because somebody had been hurt. It scared me to death. But when I saw an employee get hurt, it's just so important for workers to have that. Number 11, the 11th trait comes out of workman's compensation. He cared for people. He cared for people. He did, and it was obvious by his actions. After office, he says, if there is to be a war, I'm still physically fit. I would want to be a part of it. On the transition to Taft, he doesn't call Taft in for breakfast and say, Taft, you're the man. You're going to be the next president. I'm going to support you. He sends one of his secretaries, William Loeb, to tell Taft that he's the heir apparent. People ask Roosevelt constantly, will you run again? Will you run again? And he could run again because there wasn't any term limit or third term. It wasn't even really a third term, I guess, because he took on a partial term and the amendment really didn't pass till 1947. But Roosevelt said, no, I'm not running again. And he said about Taft, no man is so well fitted to be as Taft is to be president. But Roosevelt, this guy, he starts to try to mentor Taft. He says, hey, hit him hard, old man. And Taft is elected president by a lot over the third-time loser, Bryant. Roosevelt is such a dynamic, hard leader. He just couldn't watch anybody take over. And immediately, there starts to be a rift between him and Taft. Roosevelt decides to go to Africa. He writes along the way, and while in Africa, he collects 296 specimens, 296 animals, and the Smithsonian mounts 50 of them. He speaks everywhere on his way to Africa, Germany, France, Norway, other locations. People stop him wherever he goes around different countries, and the most frequent question is, Colonel Roosevelt, did you bring your big stick with you? They all thought the big stick was real. He went to Europe. He visited with everyone. He fought with the Pope. He met Kaiser Wilhelm, his friend in Germany, and the Kaiser told him, you're the only private citizen I've ever asked to inspect the troops with me. He takes the Queen to dinner. He meets with the King and Queen of Italy. He represents the U.S. at a British King Edward VII's funeral. During this time, he writes 35 books, 50,000 letters. And it's at this time he delivers his most famous speech, the Man in the Arena speech. Let's hear just a couple clips of it.
Oh, it is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or whether doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. Theodore Roosevelt.
Okay, my Empower You friends, this one's about you. what I tell you all the time. You got to get in the arena. You got to do something. It doesn't matter whether you're conserving a park in your neighborhood that you like, or whether you're fighting for safety on the streets of Hamilton County, or whether you've got an HOA, or you've got a political something that you're interested in. It's all about becoming the man in the arena. It's all about taking the chance, knowing that you might fail. This is the greatness of America. And Roosevelt shows once again with his speech that's delivered after he gets out of office that he is a man of big ideas. He returns home in June 1910, and he just can't reconcile with Taft. Taft and he meet. It doesn't go well. Taft says to him, "If you would just tell me, Mr. President, what you want for me to do, I'm in the dark. I don't know what to do." And Roosevelt he can't reconcile the thought of really probably anybody being president other than him. Roosevelt starts promoting the Square Deal in 1910. The Square Deal really meant three things: control the corporations, control consumer protection, control conservation of national resources. And he says on the ownership of railways, I don't want to own the railways. I don't want socialism in the United States. I want a new nationalism. I want executive power. I want protection of human welfare and property rights. The media starts to turn on him a little bit. They start to portray him not like they have before. And they ask the question, you may have heard this one before, is this authoritarianism? In this cartoon, they say, how did we get to thinking this guy should make our decisions for us? 1911, the wheels start to fall off for Roosevelt. He changes. He becomes more progressive. Woodrow Wilson emerges as a candidate for the Democrats. Roosevelt runs as a progressive, wins in Pennsylvania, Maryland, and California. He says, "I'll be the next compromise candidate." And at the Republican convention in 1912, a lot of Republicans came to him and said, "We want to nominate you, Teddy, but you know how this politics goes. Taft, it's going to be a second term for him. We've got to go with Taft." Roosevelt joins the Bull Moose Party, which is a more progressive party called the National Progressive Party. And then this happens on October 14th, 1912.
October 14, 1912, former President Theodore Roosevelt was in Milwaukee, Wisconsin to deliver a speech because he was campaigning for another run as president. Before he delivered his speech, he was shot in the chest by John Fleming Schrank. The bullet entered his chest but was slowed down by a steel eyeglass case and his thick 50-page speech. The bullet lodged itself in his chest muscle. Roosevelt had said that since he wasn't bleeding from the mouth, he knew the bullet hadn't hit his lungs, so he planned to continue giving his speech. While blood seeped through his shirt, he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose." It was later determined by doctors that Roosevelt was safer leaving the bullet in his chest muscle than removing it, so he lived the rest of his life with a bullet in his chest.
Amazing. This is what it looked like in the New York Times that day. Maniac in Milwaukee shoots Colonel Roosevelt. He ignores wounds, speaks an hour, goes to the hospital. This is the glass case that took the bullet that caused Roosevelt to say it takes more than that to kill a bull moose. I don't know how many of you heard last night a similar thing happened in Florida with an officer who was shot by someone. The officer was carrying a camera, one of those cameras where they record everything. The bullet hit him in the foot. He was shot in the foot, but he was also shot right in that camera. Probably saved his life. It's an incredible story. Roosevelt speaking for an hour while he's been shot. Number 12, Roosevelt was dynamic. He was just a dynamic, one-of-a-kind person. Wilson's elected in 1912. Roosevelt says the fight's over. We've been beaten. He believed his career was over, so he headed south to the Amazon River. And he was going to go on a trip called his greatest adventure. Now, Roosevelt said that any hardship, any travel must involve hardship and risk. So when I go on a vacation, it doesn't always involve hardship and risk, but these were two key components. He takes off on the River of Doubt trip in Brazil, and he has his 23-year-old son Kermit with him. In 1913, the expedition got underway. It lasted 2 months. Over half of the animals died from exhaustion. Lack of supplies forced Roosevelt and his team to have all sorts of problems. Conditions got extreme. There were alligators, piranhas, mosquitoes attacking the 22 men. This is what it looked like. He had a run-in with wildlife, rapids, whitewater rapids, their canoes. A Brazilian worker, one of the 22, dies. Roosevelt is stalked by Indians. One dog was shot with arrows from an Indian. The natives give Roosevelt a pass, but several members of the group suffer from malaria, dysentery, and a lack of supplies. In just 2 months, Roosevelt loses 25% of his body weight. At one point, he says, "If it's necessary for me to leave my bones in South America, I am quite ready to do so." It's a low point. All the clothes that they were wearing had been reduced to rags. Roosevelt is delirious with fever, infection. He demands to his son, "Please just leave me in the jungle to die." And with the aid of Brazilian pioneers who lived in the jungle, they get Roosevelt out. He returns in 1914 to a crowd of admirers in New York. That led to him having to watch Woodrow Wilson. He thought Wilson should enter World War I early when German armies pressed towards Paris. He fought with Wilson about it. He was nominated by the Bull Moose Party in June of 1916, but declined that. And after boats were sunk in 1917, Woodrow Wilson declares a state of war in World War I. Roosevelt at the time, this is a funny story, meets Black Jack Pershing, a famous general, and he says, "Black Jack, I want to lead one of the divisions." Roosevelt's 59. Pershing says, "I was charmed by him. He's a big boy. There's sweetness about him," but Woodrow Wilson said, "There's not a chance we're letting Roosevelt in the Army. He would just have butt heads with everyone." Roosevelt's 4 sons fought bravely in World War I. His son Quentin died. Roosevelt said, "Both life and death are parts of the same great adventure. Never yet an adventure worthily carried through by the man who put his personal safety first." He took ill in 1918, went to the hospital, and on January 5th, 1919, he went to bed and died the cause of a blood clot. He was 60. Most people believed he would have never supported the League of Nations that Woodrow Wilson proposed. Many of you have probably heard of that. His last speech, he said in 1920 at the age of, he was 59 or 60, he said, "If the Republican Party wants me, I can advance the ideas, I will be a candidate." This is Roosevelt, one of the last photos taken of him before at his home in Sagamore in 1918. On his passing, the Vice President of the United States said, "Death had to take him sleeping, for if he had been awake, there would have been a fight." What was he known for? He was known as the first modern president. He completed the transition in the United States to a strong executive. He endowed the progressive movement by trying to make society more fair. What do you think about that? Trying to make society more fair with economic possibilities. He believed that the government had the right to regulate big business. And last but not least, number 13, he had a charisma that was just overwhelming. It was really something. This is what William James, who wrote the book The Powers of Man, says about Woodrow Wilson. He's like one of us. He is Teddy to the nation. He is energizing. He talks about principles of right and wrong, common sense, honesty, courage, energy, resolution, readiness to learn. No man of a generation has used himself more effectively than Theodore Roosevelt. I think there's a case to be made that Theodore Roosevelt was surely the most popular president of his time. This is how historians rank him. There's a lot of historians, but a lot of them were the same, and a lot of them rate Abraham Lincoln 1, George Washington 2, Franklin D. Roosevelt 3, Theodore Roosevelt 4, Dwight Eisenhower 5th. Comparisons to Trump. Oh, do I have time to do that? They're just kind of fun. They're both hard workers. They speak their mind, like to argue with judges, fight for their principles. They like to be directly involved in negotiations, similar ideas about executive power. And this is one I'm sure you all like. They both hated Harvard. I think the substantial difference with Trump is ideas about tariffs and also just the ability of Roosevelt to get together the American people and get them all kind of going for the same thing without a lot of this stuff that's going on. Maybe we're just in a different time. I don't know. I'm going to have to let you make that call, whether there could be somebody like that now who could get that done. So I started tonight with a thesis for you. Was Teddy Roosevelt one of the greatest American presidents? And does he belong on the Mount Rushmore? And I see our producer Jerry has put up an audience poll. Was Teddy Roosevelt, it's a simple yes or no, was Teddy Roosevelt one of the greatest American presidents and deserving of being on Mount Rushmore? Let's see, go ahead, vote. And maybe a question or two, maybe a thought or two that you've got about Teddy Roosevelt, what you think about him. Anybody out there got a thought about the traits? We've got corruption, expert in foreign affairs, brave, hard worker, personally involved, a marketer, big idea guy, peace fixer. He fixed things. He was principled. He cared about people. He was dynamic, and he was charismatic. I've got one person so far who says no. That's good. And let me see if I can read. Okay. Thank you to Mandy. I thought it was Henry Clay. There were two people when I talked about the War of 1812 that were kind of in the same vein, but Henry Clay's the other third-time loser for president. Anybody else have any thought about Theodore Roosevelt? I know I've talked a lot, sorry, but I really wanted you to get a sense of who this guy was and what he was. So I think overwhelmingly people said yeah. Now I had one other group say, well, the Mount Rushmore was built in 1927 to 1941 is when they built it, and who else maybe other than those three, maybe other than James Madison or someone like that would have necessarily been on Mount Rushmore. I don't know for sure. So thank you for voting. Anybody else? Do you know? Question from Leanne. Do you know that Theodore's Greek origin means gift of God or God given? Thank you, Leanne. Thanks for that. Thanks for that point that you make.
Come on along, get ready, wear your brand new gown. Well, that's going to be a meeting. Give me good and down. When you know everybody and they all know you, and you get a rabbit to keep up with them who do. When you hear that the craziness began, be sure but when you see it, when you get religion, you want it now this thing. There'll be a hot night, it open tonight, my baby. When you hear them bad things ding the lane, I'll just everything to my thing. Without them do, and the words will all shine in. There'll be a hot night, and on prayer tonight. There'll be girls for everybody in there. Good old cloud. There'll be something like David and Miss Good around. There'll be something be them, and she's all red, red. I just run there and killed them, and to me this weakness. Please, oh please, oh do not let me down. You trust in mother. It's you been you'll be my man. I am my man at all. There'll be a lot there and on tonight. My baby, when you're here, them fountain days are made. I'm desperate. And we can see baby, when the birds and do. In the courts we'll all dine in. There'll be a lot of time in all there tonight. I forgot.
And I just want to thank you for joining me tonight. And I want you to go out, like I always tell you, I want you to go out and I want you to do great things and I want you to empower you.